Over the last decade, horror pop culture has begun to find a sort of fascination with cordyceps and Ophicordyceps fungus, specifically of the family Unilateralis. These two different genus of fungi are what make up the zombie fungus that is often portrayed in movies and video games as able to animate living beings to perform zombie-like behavior. This, of course, born from the actual capacity to cause zombie-like behavior in insects. Both will take control of insects and lead them to perform suicidal activities, although the manner in which each does is slightly different. While both will compel insects to climb out onto limbs and ledges where they have an uninterrupted view of their immediate surroundings. Cordyceps will paralyze the insect and cause multiple fibrous buds to erupt from all over their bodies and release spores as their tissue is consumed, dissolved, and replaced with mycelium. Ophiocordyceps will do much of its maturation within the host's body before the head explodes and a stalk as long as the entire host's body will unfurl. Salvador Dali, a prolific artist known for his personal eccentricities and often visceral art, went on a trip to Nepal whilst ruminating on how to expand surrealism into new realms of expression. He and a few companions stayed in a small village in the Kathmandu Valley, partaking in local cuisine and a mind-altering substance called abuan chao. Later that night, the three men staggered into a hospital in Latipur. The men were terrified, screaming in a guttural language the locals didn't understand, gripping their heads and writhing in agony. Despite the hospital's best efforts, 2 of the men died. Dali only survived because a doctor elected to give him an emergency trepanation, which relieved the unexplained cranial pressure he was experiencing. Even so, he writhed in delirium for days, moaning about men's heads swelling up like hot air balloons, and a strange voice calling to come skyward to the shared garden, to kneel and ascend. He said that the veil of reality had become liquid, and something had reached out, filling his head with so many worlds that he thought he would explode. Salvador returned to Spain 7 days later, haunted by his visions, a changed man. He created every conceivable medium of art, colored by the visions he had seen during his 3-day bout of madness, seeming possessed by a chaotic mania. Those who knew him before his trip said that whatever had come over him, he was nothing like the young artist who had graduated only a month before. One of the doctors from the hospital decided to retrace the 3 men's steps, and finally found his way to a small village called Man Kudoka. Awaiting him was a dizzying spectacle. The entire population of the city, 147 men, women, and children, were kneeling at random locations around the city, as if praying. All of their heads were gone, and in each person's neck there was an inch-thick, fibrous root, cleanly snapped off at the top, where the fruiting body, or stroma, would have been. These are dark times, and these stories come from very dark places. Hello listeners, my name is Jonas Armitage, and you're listening to Stories from Dark Places. I hope you all had a pleasant and accident-free Independence Day celebration. Being a man of dual citizenship, split between the UK and America, I've never been one for the 4th of July explosion spectacular, but somehow I let my station manager cajole me into going out with her husband, and their children to a public picnic in the nearby town where they live. It did not go as expected. What started as a fireworks parade and celebration was then interrupted by armed protesters marching against the government's attempts to quash their First, Second, and Fourth Amendment rights by expecting them to wear masks in public businesses. Then some peaceful protesters showed up to march for the Black Lives Matter movement and the defunding of the police, only to be met with hateful words and thinly veiled threats. Then some people burned a flag, someone smashed a police car windscreen, and a riot ensued. Thankfully, no one in Danielle's family was harmed, just a little spooked by the madness. I finished out my night in the studio, playing some Darkest Dungeon and listening to music. Oh, and someone left a note on my windscreen that said, "You're not welcome here, and get out of Innsmouth." But after the day's proceedings, that just felt like par for the course. Anyway, enough of my complaining. May I present to you Chapter 6 of Spores by Creepy Monkey Boy. Lee pushed his wife, holding their son ahead of him, while simultaneously shoving a man backwards behind him. "Go, Ayame, keep going," he urged her. "Tamao, hold on to my jacket." His young daughter clutched tightly onto his sleeve. Lee fingered the 3 paper tickets he had in his pocket. He had spent all of his saved money, and even sold his car to afford them, but they would save his family. Ayame stopped as the JDF soldier held up his hand at the security gate. Lee felt the person behind him push into him, not like how one impatient person pushes another, but like the very tip of a massive wave. The young soldier was wearing a white surgical mask, but had a rifle slung on his shoulder. Lee thought to himself he honestly couldn't remember the last time he saw a soldier armed in public. The soldier held a flashlight up to Ayame, checking her face and her exposed skin, and then he took some type of reading from her lips with a device that projected a red laser onto her face. He did the same thing to the small baby in Ayame's arms. The soldier waved them through and conducted the same inspection to Lee and Tamao. Lee passed through the opening last and was stopped by a pair of police officers who were detaining all 4 of them. "Passes," one of the officers said. Lee nervously handed over the 3 tickets that had cost him so much to acquire. The officer looked at him skeptically and was starting to open his mouth to say something when his attention was diverted to a sudden commotion behind Lee. A middle-aged man was trying to force his way past the same JDF soldier that Lee had just passed by. The crowd behind was starting to become agitated, and Lee could see the makeshift barricades beginning to flex inward under the crush. The soldier shoved the man backward, unslung his rifle and pointed it at him, screaming for him to stop. The man came at him again, wild-eyed and panicked, and the soldier's rifle barked twice, dropping the man into a heap on the floor. This seemed to have a sobering effect on the crowd, which immediately stopped pressing into the barricades. Lee took advantage of the opportunity and pushed his family quickly away and deeper into the concourse of the airport. They walked with several other families past a glass viewing window. Lee could see a line of passenger and freight planes taxiing onto the runway, taking off rapidly one after another. The fact that there was no delay to allow planes to land did not escape his attention, nor the very few planes remaining at the concourse. They eventually arrived at their gate and found a crowd of several hundred people screaming and jamming up to the boarding counter. There were a dozen JDF soldiers at this gate, and their rifles were not slung. Lee pushed Ayame forward through the crowd until they got close enough to get the attention of the co-pilot standing near the counter. He flashed his tickets and was waved forward. They crossed under the velvet rope that still somehow managed to restrain the crowd, and Lee handed him the tickets. "There are only 3, the co-pilot said. "Do you have another?" "No." Lee shook his head. The co-pilot looked at them individually, then to the crowd behind him. "I'm sorry, one of you must stay." Ayame looked at Lee in horror. "Why is he saying that?" she asked him. "You said we could bring Bu without a ticket." Lee reached forward and stroked her hair alongside her face. A tear formed in the corner of his eye. "I could not afford the last ticket for us. I needed for you to leave and be safe." Ayame started slapping him on the chest. This woke Bu, who started crying. "You lied to me! You lied to me!" she repeated. Lee grabbed her free hand and restrained her. "You and Tamao and Bui will be safe. That is enough for me," he said. "Australia is safe. It is an island." "This is an island," she screamed. "It did not save us." "It will be different. You will be safe there," he repeated stubbornly. "Please go." Tamao grabbed her father's leg and clutched tightly. "No, princess. You must go with your mother and keep your brother safe." Tamao looked up into her father's face. "Will you come later?" she asked. "Of course. As soon as the planes return, I will board one and come find you," he lied. He knew that no planes would ever fly back to Japan. Lee ushered his family forward along with the co-pilot, who led them to walk down the jet bridge to the waiting plane. Behind him, Lee heard several more shots, followed by a roar of a mob unleashed. He heard the sounds of cracking and breaking plastic that he knew was the barricades finally giving away. The soldiers immediately sprinted off toward the rumbling sound further away. The co-pilot closed and locked the door to the jet bridge, to the immediate protest of the small crowd still waiting at the boarding counter. Lee watched from the window as his wife's plane was pulled away from the concourse even before the side door was closed shut. He looked back and was shocked to see a wave of people running toward the gate. The soldiers tried to block their passage, but were quickly engulfed and overrun. Lee began sprinting away from the gateway and further into the concourse. "Follow me!" he screamed. "There are planes still down here!" He was quickly overtaken by the faster runners in the group, but had successfully led the mob away from his wife's vulnerable plane. He let himself be swept up in the random, confused river of humanity as they aimlessly rushed up and down the concourse, ripping open bridgeway doors that led to empty air. More than a few people were pushed through these portals to fall into crippling heaps on the ground far below. Lee managed to swim sideways through the crowd and hug a large window. He watched as a few, and then many people sprinted down the tarmac, chasing the last few departing planes. One man managed to grab onto the landing gear of a jet as it started to take off. The man valiantly held on as the jet quickly accelerated and began rising into the air. And Lee watched as the man fell to a certain death from several hundred feet in the air. Eventually, the crowd thinned and filtered out of the concourse as it became apparent that the jets had all left. Thousands crowded around a pair of empty helicopters near a hangar. Lee used the opportunity to begin to slip out the front of the airport. He stood and faced west, looking out across the bay next to Nagasaki Airport. In the distance, he could see the dark clouds of an approaching spore storm rolling across the East China Sea. He may or may not have time to make it home. Lee felt a tug at his sleeve and looked down in surprise. Tamao looked back up at him and smiled. Lee immediately scooped her up and hugged her. "Tamao, why are you here? Where is your mother?" he asked as he wrapped his arms around her face. "I snuck away while she was getting on the plane. I wanted to fly with you," she said innocently. Lee began crying and squeezed his daughter tightly to his chest. Yes, he reassured her. "We will meet them next week. Come on. Let's go home and see if we have noodles to make." He looked warily back at the dark storm approaching faster than he expected. The cloud that he knew brought infection, suffering, and death. I don't have any pertinent analysis for this installment, I'm sorry. It's terribly sad, foreboding, and dreadful. Hopeless, really. But the world outside of my broadcast booth feels just as dead inside these days. I need to find something to cut the mire. Maybe some more video games. If you have any suggestions of games I should pick up, make sure to comment on Twitter. I'm open to suggestions. Anyway, that's all the time we have tonight. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our YouTube subscribers, as well as those of you who've come from Apple Podcast, Anchor, Podcast Addict, CastBox, whatever other podcast platform you frequent, for taking the time to come and share the story with me. Sometimes when I question what I'm doing here, it helps to know that someone's listening. Anyway, good night, listeners. And please, the next time you feel like something is watching you from the shadows, remember, there's nothing to be afraid of. After all, some of the best things only happen in the dark.
Stories from Dark Places was recorded before an imaginary studio audience. All stories performed on this podcast have express written consent from the original author. Jonas Armitage, his studio manager, and the entire staff of WZHP Radio Innsmouth are fictitious characters, and it's probably for the best that you continue to believe that. Don't waste time worrying about the things you can't change. Focus on the things you can. Look out for your loved ones, be kind to each other, and remember to vote.